What's up, comic book fans? Anchorpete here, and next door to me is my friend Brian, Mr. Core's hair. Brian and I, we have discussed the first two episodes of Jupiter's Legacy, which you guys can find on Netflix. And for today, we are discussing episodes 3 and 4. Did you like episodes 3 and 4 better than episodes 1 and 2?
These episodes felt very much like fillery to me. I feel like they could have done this they could have mostly combined these episodes into one, and it wouldn't have been that much of a loss.
Yeah.
There are things I liked about it, and it still has me slightly interested. There's a lot of differences from the comic. There's like a lot.
Yes.
I mean, other than a few like direct panel references or situation references, it's kind of going off on its own direction. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I'm still interested, I guess, but still, I'm not all that high on this show.
Okay. All right. Well, with that being said, we are going to be full spoilers from now on. So these are spoilers for the comic and spoilers for the show. And so if you haven't watched the show, go ahead and check it out on Netflix and join us for episodes 3 and 4. So Brian, what did they keep from the comic that you noticed?
Well, so the third episode centers on Hutch, who is arguably a main character in the comic or the original comic volume.
Yeah.
And the fact that he is he's a criminal and he has Blue Bolt's rod as his like weapon or whatever because he doesn't have powers, unlike everyone else that had powers as children. It seems to have power. So, and if it hasn't been mentioned, his dad is George Hutchins, aka Skyfox, who does eventually turn on the Union, in the past time frame, or I guess the time frame we haven't seen yet,
right?
Because it's kind of more in the middle of how it began and where they are now.
Yeah.
And then the only actual thing from the panel I remember is he's talking to those two gangsters. And he sends one into like a shark-infested waters.
Yes.
And that was literally the only thing that I remember from the panel on that episode.
Yeah. So in this episode, there are these thugs that he's talking to, that Hutch is talking to, and like Brian said, he sends these two guys. He sends one of them to shark-infested waters. Right? He has this rod that essentially can like teleport himself or other people anywhere. Right? And so one of the guys grabs the rod and then Hutch says, "Shark-infested waters," and the guy disappears. In the episode, you don't see the guy in the waters, but in the comic, they show the guy in the water and he's like getting ripped apart by sharks. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Those thugs work for a guy named Big Man, which in the comic they reference, but in the show we actually get to meet Big Man. And I thought he was kind of cool. He's kind of intimidating. He was big. His face sort of got red when he'd get angered. Like it would kind of glow, almost like a Ghost Rider. Like he had like a fire inside of him.
Yeah, and he had a very very deep voice, assuming based on his powers in some regard.
Yeah, and the guy was like literally probably like, I don't know, 7'6" or something.
Yeah, he looked huge.
Yeah. So I actually liked those interactions. I liked all those scenes. And in the difference between the comic and the show is that at one point those guys go to intimidate Hutch. So he says Big Man's heart, and the rod disappears, and then it comes back and it's all bloody. And so you know that he can like use it as a weapon in that regard.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing to point out here is that I don't think that was how it worked in the comic necessarily, or they didn't point it out.
Yeah.
They're implying in the show that he no matter who is holding the rod, he's the only one that controls it. I don't think that was brought up in the comic at all. I kind of like how the show has changed that power. I think that's an interesting facet to it.
Yeah. I think in general, he's probably one of the most likable characters on the show so far. What do you think?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
So Hutch's dad, George Hutchinson's, they focus on him in this episode as well. And he's kind of like the equivalent of Batman. But everybody's got powers, and Batman notoriously does not. But in the comics, Skyfox kind of can like invent things, like forge, essentially.
Okay.
He's always making stuff. So, and he's kind of like this mastermind. But what did you think about the stuff with his dad in the show?
It was interesting. I mean, they're showing stuff about that I don't believe the comic covered, where about how they got the plan together to go to this island. In the comic, they're just saying, "Hey, we're in the past. We're going to this island. Something's there. I feel it. It's there." And there's no. Everyone seems very confident in everybody, and everything's on the up and up. But everybody here is going through bad stuff.
Yes.
Sheldon and Walt obviously lost their dad. And then George apparently has lost all his money. And I think, that's going to play into the decision here, because it seems like Sheldon really listens to George as like a best friend kind of figure.
Yeah.
And, it's being framed that he's allowing him to follow up on these crazy whims because he needs some kind of get-rich-quick scheme, sort of a resolution to his life.
Talk about the whole island trip in the comics. That's only really in the very beginning of the first issue. And it's like the first 3 pages or so. I think you said this last episode too. And what kind of blows my mind is that all this stuff takes place in like 1932, 1933. And so the thing that I think Mark Millar, the writer, is trying to get across is that like superheroes, or the idea of superheroes, helped us get over the Great Depression, or they were something that kind of inspired us and gave us hope. And so I think that that's sort of the metaphor of this whole journey, is like trying to save America after the Great Depression, and that like superheroes are the answer. Do you think I'm onto something there?
I think you're 100% correct there, although I do think it's kind of weird to the idea like, oh, we're going to give you superpowers to save America.
Yes.
It's like a weird, like, oh, you said that out loud? It sounds crazy.
Yeah. Well, it's very weird because it's like they're saving America from an economic crisis. They're like,
yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
How do we fix the economy? Let's get X-ray vision and laser eyes, right? Oh, okay, yeah, that solves it. What? But it's cool because all this stuff predates Superman, right? Because Superman showed up in April of 1938, the first issue of Action Comics. So, like, the idea with this is that the Utopian and his Union, they come before Superman would have showed up.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So with that episode, we see what we call Hutch and like a crew of kind of superpowered criminals trying to like pull off a heist, right?
Yep.
And what do you think of his crew?
Well, the first thing I noticed was, and I think you might have noticed as well, one of his crew members is the actress who plays Robin in The Boys, which I started watching, and I cannot mention that she also plays Marianne in Letterkenny, which I'm obsessed with. So,
okay.
She plays like a female hockey player, and I love every character in that show. So it's nice to see familiar faces in other shows.
Yeah, what does she have? She has some sort of like sonic powers on this show, right?
Seems like it, yeah. And I don't particularly remember any of these characters being in the comic. No. I mean, they just, like, Hutch's introduction panel, like, literally is the shark-infested waters bit.
They pull off this heist, and the heist is a lot of fun. They are being chased by these superpowered guys, and they're in this van, and this one Australian guy who has, like, ice powers, it's his van, and somehow he makes his van, like, kind of phase through the wall. I thought that was really cool. They're all scot-free to think, okay, they did it, they got away from those guys, but then they accidentally crash right into Chloe, and just because she's so powerful, just fucks up the van completely.
Yep, and Chloe's having a bad day.
Yeah. And so they decided to take her on, even though what I really liked about that part was that they were like, oh, shit, that's the Utopian's daughter. Like, we got to watch out.
Yes.
Because it is, that's one of the things I do like about the show. I definitely liked about the comic. But I think the show does this right, which is they give off the idea of like, oh, man, that's Superman's daughter. Like, we're not fucking with Superman.
And I also want to mention, too, that, you don't see much of Walt in this episode. But, I mean, like, I'm finding it harder to follow that he's going to end up being the villainous version that we know in the comic.
Yes. I'm really glad you brought that up because having just read the comic again recently, he's like way more villainous in the comic. I mentioned this in our last recording too. Yeah. But you can see he, like, from the very get-go, he's like pushing, we got to change the world. Things aren't working. The politicians are corrupt. They're not doing their job. And a major difference between this show and the comic is that the comic is just very like brutal and unforgiving. It's brutal in the violence that the characters do to each other. It's also just in the way the characters talk to each other too. They say some like real nasty things to each other. And like spoilers for the comic, the utopian son, Brandon, and his brother Walt are gonna essentially have like a coup, and they're gonna kill the utopian and his wife. And that is like such a brutal scene. I just watched it. I read that recently, and I was like, oh man, this is actually worse than I remembered it. And I honestly, though, I feel like that is such an appeal of the comic because the comic came out in 2013. The idea of like deconstructing superheroes was not so played out at that point. And so to see this kind of brutality between superheroes, I think was pretty novel at that time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that like with this Netflix, see, because, Brian mentioned Robin from The Boys. And I just started watching The Boys recently and Preacher too. We're on kind of like a Garth Ennis kick. The Boys show and Preacher capture that sort of violence and that graphic nature of Garth Ennis's writing. And I feel like this show does not capture the brutality of Mark Millar's writing. What do you think?
I agree with the lone exception of the punch on Black Star's face from the first and second episode. But yeah, other than that, yes.
This one of the critics referred to the show as like toothless, and I actually kind of feel like that is the case. That it's kind of oddly not as aggressive. Besides that, like you said, that one punch to the face where he just caved in the Black Star's face.
Now, I wonder, could that be like a Netflix thing? I mean.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I kind of wanted to bring up is that we talked about Steven S DeKnight being the showrunner, right?
Yep.
Steven S DeKnight got kicked off the show, and he's not a part of the show from episode 5 on. So I wonder if like maybe he was pushing for it to be more graphic or more like the comic, and maybe they made it more tame, or maybe it was like it wasn't as interesting, and maybe the show kind of really ramps up towards the end. I don't know.
That is interesting. I did not even know he was kicked off the show. So I'm very curious to see if there's any kind of shift. Although for the most part, when that happens mid-show, like I feel like I don't notice it all that much.
Because it this kind of makes me want to go on a little Mark Millar kick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So guys, if you remember last week, we talked about how Mark Millar's stuff has been adapted in, Wanted and Kingsman and Kick-Ass. They've all been made into movies, right? And now this show. Well, Mark Millar, just like a lot of us comic book fans, he really likes the idea of like interconnecting everything. And Brian, did you know that like a good majority of his books all take place in the same universe?
Yes, Millar World, yes.
Yes. And what's cool about Millar World, I'm just going to do a little rant for our viewers or whatever, is that Wanted is like the main story of Millar World, and it's this world where superheroes have taken over the world and they're controlling things from behind the scenes. Well, Kick-Ass takes place in that world. Like he's a up-and-coming superhero in that world, and he's on like a street level. And then that leads to another book of his called Superior, which is like a Superman type book. And Superior is a kid that's like, he's got some kind of illness, he's in a wheelchair, and he's able to get his powers from a comic book. And the comic book world that he's getting his powers from is the Jupiter's Legacy comic.
Interesting. Okay.
That's cool, right?
Yeah, that is really, I mean, Superior is like one of the few things I haven't read out of this stuff, but that's an interesting way to connect it all.
Yeah, and the thing is that Jupiter's Legacy in this Millar world, Jupiter's Legacy is a comic and it's a movie series, but it is based on a superhero that was alive before the villains took over.
Interesting. So I don't remember the timeline, or if they even mentioned a timeline in Wanted. Like I'm guessing that's a more future state kind of thing then at that point, right?
So for Wanted, the villains take over in 1986.
Oh, wow.
And so one key thing that if you guys haven't read it, just so we can explain real quick, is that the villains do such a thorough job taking over the world that they erase the idea that superheroes ever existed. They make people think that superheroes are just in fiction, and so they erase the idea of the utopian.
So wait, when does Kick-Ass take place then?
Kick-Ass takes place in like the regular modern world, but I guess he's like not considered enough of a threat, so they don't do anything about it.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And so like Kingsman, Secret Service, that's in this world too. And then there's this other comic called Nemesis, where there's this guy who's almost like a anarchist kind of supervillain. That's in this world. There's also this other book called MPH, which is like with people that take these pills and get superpowers. That's in this whole Millar world too. And so while I'm on this little Mark Millar kick, just two other things too. We mentioned how his books have been converted into movies, right? We've mentioned that Wanted and Kick-Ass, Kingsman, but we totally forgot to mention that like some of his Marvel work has been turned into movies too.
What?
Civil War. Mark Millar,
my God, yes.
Mark Millar wrote Civil War.
That is correct. I completely blanked on that. Yeah, I mean, although I feel like the MCU Civil War is a bit different. I mean, it still has the core conflict at play, but it is a very different story than the comic book.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a very different story, just like Old Man Logan is a very different story than Logan.
Yeah.
But you could absolutely say that was an influence on the movie Logan.
Yes, definitely.
And then Civil War, like I said. But then, of course, he also wrote the comic The Ultimates, which was about the Avengers. And like so much of the Ultimates is the Avengers in the MCU.
I mean, really, that's where you credit Samuel Jackson as Nick Fury as well.
Right.
Wow, man, I didn't think about any of this.
Yes.
Yeah, he's clearly had a huge impact on the the adapted comic book movie.
Yes. So to me, it's so ironic because every single thing that I just listed, I find so much more compelling and so much more entertaining than this show. And I think that's so weird,
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, so far, the show is there. It's maybe it could have been trimmed down, and I would have maybe enjoyed it a little bit better. Because I mean, we didn't really talk about the fourth episode, but essentially, it's just the same day as the third episode. But it's just Chloe's point of view and her hitting rock bottom. She's, on drugs and losing her contracts, and then she's literally getting fired, and then that's when the van hits her.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is there really even anything to say about the fourth episode other than that? Like, I mean, actually, no, there is one very important thing, I guess. And this is something that I really liked, was that the stuff that Hutch was stealing, which is like this bag of blue crystals, Chloe started just huffing.
Yeah.
And then it turns out it's the power source of, the Hutch's rod.
Oh, I didn't make that connection. Holy shit.
So, which I don't think was something in the comic, and I like that little twist there. So that's kind of a reason to bring them together. I mean, Chloe definitely recognized Hutch because they must have met at some point in their lives because their parents were friends.
Yeah.
So, and I like that little twist there that he needs that rod has to be powered by something, and he had it, and you may be running out of it.
Look, as far as episode 4 goes, you're right, man. There's not much to it. And unfortunately, episode 4 kind of was like a low point for me because this whole aspect where Sheldon is walking in like the dust belt, and he goes, I think he's in like Kansas or something, right?
Yeah.
And he meets Red from that 70s show, right? And to me, it just felt like, oh man, they are really dragging out this past storyline.
Yeah, they didn't need to. Like we mentioned earlier, the comic just established it. It was like, okay, good for me, and that's it. But they're really dragging this out, and I hope they get to the point sooner rather than later.
I feel like they are just establishing everything in this first season, and then the second season is all going to be about the coup and like Chloe surviving the coup. And then the third season, if there ever is a third season, will be like a time jump and we see Chloe and Hutch's kid. And that's what the third season would be if they ever get to that point.
That would be some interesting pacing, although it would seem like a waste to waste a whole season preparing for it, I guess,
So Brian and I, like he said, we're going to do the rest of the show and we're going to just kind of sum up the show in one more episode. And then probably by the time that premieres, we're just going to be a couple of days away from Loki, right?
Yes, actually something we haven't mentioned. Well, Loki is now a little earlier. So it's June 9th, and it's going to be a Wednesday show. So that's going to be a little different for us.
Yes, good point. Good point. Yes, we're still going to do our live shit where like we watch the show and we do it at night, which would be like 9 p.m. Central Time, but it'll be on a Wednesday night.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, man. So we'll see if this show gets better as time goes on. Maybe it'll get better by the last episode, and we will see if they have that coup or not. But we will give you guys all that information in our next episode. All right. So, Brian, until then, we'll see you next time.
Bye.